In this video, we're going to talk about 3 more songwriting myths that you believe or that you might believe and that we should dispel. So if you missed the first video, I do have another video with 3 other myths. I'll be sure to throw the link in the description and in a card above so you can check that out after this video is over. Order is not important for the record, but let's talk about 3 more myths that a lot of songwriters seem to believe that we shouldn't believe. So the first one we're going to talk about, and perhaps my biggest pet peeve of all when it comes to songwriting and sort of songwriter culture or songwriting education culture, is that music theory is worthless or non-helpful or not important academic knowledge, which I don't even know what academic knowledge is supposed to mean. Is the implication that it is only useful in an academic setting and it doesn't actually help you with creativity and it doesn't actually help you to understand how to write music to have a certain effect or to actually know what you're doing and not just rely on magic and the muse to magically gift you with the right notes out of nowhere despite the fact that you don't understand any of it? I'm showing my hand here because I think it's utterly ridiculous. It's one of those things that I sometimes honestly struggle to even figure out how to explain, because to me, I was a songwriter or started songwriting before I knew music theory. And then I learned a lot of music theory in high school with my music theory classes and music composition classes. And I cannot even begin to describe the difference. Legitimately knowing music theory versus not knowing music theory probably made me at least 10 times better of a songwriter and at least 10 times more efficient at writing music. Even things as simple as understanding keys and understanding, for example, that you are writing a song in the key of G major. So in the context of G major, you know that largely the notes you should be using are just the notes you have in G major, which is going to be G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. Those are the notes you have. So now you understand that any chord you make or any melody that you write should probably be using those notes, which is not to say you can't break outside of that sometimes, but it's a good starting place to start with, that the vast majority of songs do tend to stay in a single key, or at least stay in a single key during the time they're in that key. Maybe there's a key change or something. But the tendency is most songs, if they're in the key of A major, for example, they will stick with the A major notes and chords that only contain notes in A major. And something as simple as that really is the difference between somebody sitting at an instrument and basically being like, I guess I'll just do like a G chord, a C chord, and a D chord again because those go well together, and somebody who can sit at an instrument and basically be like, give me a key, and they can just improvise for hours. Like if you told me, hey Joseph, can you improvise in the key of E major? I could just sit at a keyboard or piano and do that for hours and hours and hours and just not stop and keep basically improvising new music constantly. And that's not because I'm crazy talented or anything like that. It's just the fact that I know keys. And I know that, like, in the context of the key of E major, I know what notes I have. And I know that an E major chord has the role of the 1 chord or the tonic chord, which is going to be that chord that I need to return to once in a while to give a sense of where home is and sort of give context to the rest of the song. And I understand that the strongest chord to go back into that 1 chord is going to be my B major chord. Why? Because it's a 5 chord, and a 5 chord tends to be the strongest chord that feels the pull back to the 1 chord. So going from a 5 chord to a 1 chord in the context of any key is going to be a super strong transition that makes that 1 chord extra powerful. And this is just diving into the super basics of music theory that are endlessly helpful. You can go even further, and maybe you want to write a song that is like really, really dark. If you don't know music theory at all, well, good luck. You're just going to be basically making not even educated guesses and playing random notes until you find something good. Maybe if you understand music theory, you think to yourself, okay, if I want it to be really dark, I want it to be in a key, or in this case, a mode that is even darker than a minor key, which would be the Phrygian mode. So then you maybe start improvising in the context of some Phrygian mode, let's say C Phrygian mode or something like that, and you know that it's going to have a darker sound than a minor key. So it's going to sound really, really dark. And if you don't know music theory, you wouldn't know where to start with any of these things. You'd just be taking a shot in the dark. And that's certainly okay to start. It's not something where like you need to drop everything and learn everything about music theory, But music theory is something super, super helpful. And literally everyone who is a songwriter would be helped by learning music theory, at least the very basics. That's why I often talk about what I call the 4 pillars of music theory, and I have a free guide on that. I'll put a link in the description to it, which really teach the 4 parts of music theory that I think are absolutely essential and get you at least 90% of the way there for being efficient as a songwriter, which is really understanding intervals, keys, chords, and chord progressions. If you understand those 4, you're well on your way. There is tons of music theory that is super, super, super helpful when it comes to songwriting. And maybe if you're finding yourself right now sort of being doubtful about this, something to look into is go check out Rick Beato. You're on YouTube. Rick Beato is a great resource for realizing the beauty and the importance of music theory, especially when it comes to writing music, understanding music, hearing other music, and figuring out how they got the effect they got. Music theory is something that's super, super, super helpful, and I can't encourage you enough to at least start taking the dive into learning some music theory. And now I'm going to go sort of to the opposite side of things, which is something that I think a lot of people think is really important that honestly I don't think is very important at all, and that is chord progression. Now, just as a caveat here, I'm not saying that you can throw any chord progression in and chord progressions don't matter. What I'm saying is, as far as determining whether a song is interesting or whether somebody likes a song or not, the chord progression is one of the least relevant factors in that. Nobody likes a song because, oh man, the chord progression is awesome. When's the last time you heard somebody say that? Have you ever heard anybody say that? Ever? Usually it's going to be things like the melody or great lyrics or an awesome hook, whether that be a synth hook or a guitar solo or whatever. Almost always it's going to not be the chord progression. And even if the chord progression is baller and the chord progression is something that people really like, it probably is still not the star of the show and is not the main reason they like it. Almost definitely more important factors are going to be the melody and the lyrics and other parts of the song. Because honestly, you can have a really interesting song that has only 1 or 2 chords, because the reality is that if the melody is really interesting, nobody's listening to the chords. The chords are just a backdrop and a context. They're in a support role. So at the end of the day, the chords you should choose and the chords you should write should generally be something that best supports the melody. Whatever the melody needs, that's what the chords should be. And if the melody really needs just 2 chords, and honestly using different chords would just not service the melody as well, 2 chords it is, and nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to notice, except maybe music theory nerds will notice, but does it really matter? No, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, melody reigns supreme. And then even though a lot of people admittedly don't listen to lyrics or pay attention to lyrics, lyrics are still super important as well, because while that may be true, a lot of people don't pay attention, there are a lot of people who do pay attention and who really, really, really care about lyrics. And at the end of the day, is a song really good if the entire message of it, if the entire lyrics of it, which is what the song is actually about, is nothing or garbage or something really dumb? Like, no, of course not. So we should take pride in our lyrics, regardless of how many people actually notice how much we put into our lyric writing craft. But when it comes to chord progressions, people generally don't notice, don't care, and at the end of the day, they are in a support role, not a starring role. So it should take the backseat to your melody and other more important things, which, by the way, is why I often recommend not starting your song with a chord progression, because it's one of the least important parts of the song. You should start with something more important, like a memorable riff or hook or a melody or maybe even the lyrics. Those are all better things to start with than chord progression. Generally, I do think you should mix it up. So sometimes start with chord progression, of course, just like sometimes you should start with a bass line. You should always be mixing it up. But if you find yourself almost always starting with a chord progression, I'd encourage you to change it up. You might have some really, really awesome results and end up writing more interesting, cooler melodies, because when you write something first, you have more creative room that allows you to be not constrained by the chord progression. Because once you write a chord progression, it kind of constrains your melody. It constrains the guitar riff that you can write. It constrains the solo you can do on top of it. But if you start with something more important like melody, then the melody dictates the chords instead of the chords somewhat dictating the melody, or at least influencing the melody, which is a better order to go in generally. And the last myth I want to talk about is kind of a weird one, but it's the idea that you or I should try to chase specific specific things such as writing a song like a specific artist or specifically writing a song because of what is currently popular. And at the heart of this is the idea that there is a difference between being inspired by other music and actively chasing and actively trying to be like other music. It's a great thing to be influenced by other music. All of us are deeply, deeply influenced by some of our favorite artists and songs we really love. That is important. That's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a difference between being inspired by different artists we like and sitting down and being like, I want to write the next Ariana Grande song, right? Or sound just like Ariana Grande or whoever you might say. You don't want to do that to yourself because nobody wants a second-rate anyone. If you think about it, like, have you ever known a popular artist or an artist a lot of people love that is a second-rate somebody else? How many people are like, oh, wow, yeah, they're sort of like the Beatles, but not. I love them. I've never heard anybody say anything like that because universally what people usually want is you and I to be first-rate you and me be first-rate me instead of me being a poor imitation of an artist that they love. Because to use the Beatles as an example, if you are like the Beatles but just not nearly as good and not as original, because nobody's more original to the Beatles than the Beatles, right? Nobody's more original to Elvis than Elvis. So if you try to be that but you're not that, like, why would the person just not listen to the original or the one they already love? Instead, you should be true to what you are, which is probably going to be a mix of all your favorite artists combined with some of just what you are, which is a great thing. You should lean into that. Don't spend all your time trying to be certain artists or specifically writing lyrics in the way that you see the current like maybe radio songs are or your favorite artists. And this is not to say that I think you shouldn't sometimes do this. Sometimes if you say to yourself, so-and-so writes killer bass lines, I'm going to write a song that is inspired by that artist that writes killer bass lines. But overall, we need to make sure we have our own sound, which is not something that should just be copy and pasted from somebody else. Be true to you rather than trying to be something. And this is going to be true across the board, whether we're talking about you trying to be another artist or you trying to do what you think the right thing is when it comes to lyric writing, or you writing about something that you think is topical now, or you think will be popular now, or you think will get a good reaction now or something. Overall, just be a first-rate you rather than a second-rate somebody else. Because at the end of the day, the only thing truly unique about you and I is you and I. So hopefully this was helpful to you. And if it was, or my first myth made you think, maybe I should learn some music theory, a great place to start is checking out my free guide on the 4 pillars of music theory, the music theory that I think every songwriter needs to know. Free guide, link in the description down below. But it is all about just the 4 pillars that I think are most essential, which are intervals, chords, chord progressions, and keys. If you understand those 4 things, which are not that hard, by the end of the guide, if you read the guide and follow the directions in there of how to read the guide and get the most from it, if you go through that process, you will understand those 4 things, and that will be enough music theory knowledge to make you much, much, much more efficient at songwriting than you are today if you don't know any of those things, to the point that just knowing what is contained in that guide is really the difference between sitting at an instrument and just taking random guesses and half of it sounding bad, and then finally you play like 3 notes in a row that sound good and you're like, oh my goodness, I found something. It's the difference between that, and if you understand just those 4 pillars, it will give you all the music theory knowledge you need to sit at an instrument and improvise for hours, never, ever, ever hitting a note that doesn't sound pretty decent. Maybe there'll be some things that sound a little hairy, but for the most part, you'll have enough knowledge to know. For example, I know all the notes I have in the key of D minor, and I know also the chords I have in the context of D minor and what each of those chords roles are in the context of the key of D minor. Like, for example, the C major chord in the context of G major versus a C major chord in the context of C major have completely different roles and sound completely different in those contexts. So context is super important when it comes to music theory. The idea that, say, a C major chord is happy is like, well, that depends. It depends on the context of the key it's in, whether it sounds happy or not. It depends on the context of the melody. So many things depend. But anyway, if you understand music theory, all of those things will become much more obvious to you. And really, that's what this guide is all about, is breaking down those 4 main pillars that will get you 80% of the way there as far as the things you really need to know as a songwriter. There's certainly more that's super helpful, like modes are super helpful to learn, and understanding other chords besides basic major and minor triads are also something that can be really important, like understanding sus chords and understanding 7th chords and things like that. Those are all helpful as well. But these 4 pillars are the main place to start and will get you most of the way there. So if you're interested, be sure to check that out. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope this was helpful to you, and I will talk to you in the next one.